Hello, everybody, and thank you all so much for coming out today. My name is Stella, and I am the president of the Organization of Cornell Planners, a graduate student association in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. I hope you all are as thrilled as I am to hear all about the ins and outs of transit planning from Matthew Rosenbloom-Jones. Matthew is currently the general manager for Tompkins Consolidated Area Transit, better known to all of us as TCAT. Matthew has extensive experience in the transportation sector and has previously served as a transit director in Wisconsin, was a transportation specialist in the city of Bowie, Maryland, and the manager of scheduling for a Kentucky Transit Authority. In addition to all of this experience, he has also held similar positions for agencies in Minnesota, Long Island, and Rochester. In addition to having proven experience in transit planning, scheduling, operations, and management, Rosenblum is also trained and licensed as a transit driver. He pursued this skill several years ago so that he could fully understand drivers' perspectives and learn all about what they encounter day in and day out while serving the public. Since becoming general manager of TCAT, he has implemented many important initiatives, such as bringing 6 new electric buses to bring further sustainable transportation options to Ithaca. All of us have probably ridden on a TCAT bus at some point during our time in Ithaca, and the system plays a crucial role in ensuring mobility options for Cornell students, Ithaca residents, as well as residents in the outer parts of Tompkins County. We hope that this conversation will educate, inform, and inspire everyone to continue to think, dream, and imagine sustainable transportation options for all of Cornell and Ithaca. Just as a reminder, we will be hosting a talk back with Matthew immediately after lecture with pizza provided. I also want to note that we have a room change because we had so much interest in this talk back, so we will now be hosting the talk back in West Sibley 101. Thank you. And with that, as a loyal rider of Route 30, I am now very excited to hand it over to Matthew. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Stella, and thank you for having me today. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought back to where I was when I was in graduate school. I knew I wanted to work in public transit. I had a little bit of commercial driving experience under my belt because when I got out of undergrad, I worked as a transit operator for a little bit. And in that role, I noticed a lot of inefficiencies and things that I thought could be done better. So I knew I really wanted to go into transit planning. So I went to SUNY Albany. I had a concentration in general transportation planning. I was very fortunate that I got to attend a transit planning class taught by Ted Orris, who was a retired career-long planner with the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York City. And it taught me a lot of useful skills. But even with all those skills, I got my first planning job at RTS in Rochester, New York. It's a big leap going into the field of transit. So I thought, what would be the most interesting things that people who are interested in transit planning or working in public transit, should have a background on? And as I put together the presentation that tries to touch on a lot of these things, what I realized is that some of these topics alone, you could do an entire hour-long presentation on, like stop spacing or fare structure. So I'm trying to touch on a lot of kind of interesting topics, focusing on planning, route structure, all of those things. But if there's something that I'm not touching off on, or you'd like me to go in greater detail on, please, more than happy to in the questions and share some of my views and experience as well. So a little bit about the planning field and the transit field and why they're different. Planning is very strategically focused. It's carried out at all levels of government. You have planners that work in local government for metropolitan planning organizations. You have planners at the federal level that work in federal agencies that are advancing federal goals. A lot of what planning does is oftentimes transit adjacent and transit supportive, but oftentimes planning is trying to gain a goal from transit, whether that's a reduced parking burden, whether that's reduced traffic congestion, improve environmental air quality. So planning is much more goal focused, while the transit field is very mission focused. You kind of are doing a rinse and repeat. Transit does it, it's fairly simple. You move people around the community, you do it over and over and over again, and those numbers grow over time, and you have fairly substantial amount of ridership. Historically, in the United States, going back to World War II and earlier, transit was a for-profit business, and it retains a lot of that muscle memory. as a business, and oftentimes acts like a business sometimes. We're trying to keep costs down, trying to keep our efficiencies up. Sometimes transit exists as a branch of a local government, sometimes it's an independent authority, and transit systems have their own planning staff, but those planning staff usually focus on medium-term, short-term, or operational planning, though some larger transit systems may have strategic planning and long-range planning as well. But you kind of do get a little bit of a contrast between the traditional planning field and planning within a transit system. So why should planners understand transit? Well, I think, as planners, a lot of us are trying to get a specific goal from transit, like I mentioned earlier. But there's things transit can and can't do. And I think it's important to understand that. There's environments that transit thrives in, and there's environments that transit does not thrive in. We all know transit struggles in low-density suburban environments that have circuitous roads and are not set up well for transit. There's also a lot of technical aspects of transit where a vehicle can fit, different vehicles of different sizes, the different types of transit that you can operate. Learning about that technical side really helps break down some of those barriers. And, there's been some examples where, there's been very well-meaning planners who try to support transit and try to have a very transit-focused neighborhood, but ultimately it fails because it's in an environment where transit is not successful. And then there's a lot of oddities about transit. And especially in the United States where transit's basically federalized and you have a lot of federal rules you have to follow, there's a lot of kind of oddities about why it's done a specific way. And understanding, I think, some of the background behind that is also very helpful to be successful in transit. So I think it's really important to understand the history of public transit. So you go back to, the 1880s and maybe even before, you have your first horse cars in U.S. cities or omnibus services. It's all private. They're turning a profit. And, over the years from the 1880s forwards, the technology really starts to take off. You get electric railways, you get steam railways, you begin to get early subways and elevated trains. And, these small sort of horse cars or omnibus companies, they start to become very big businesses. And they become part of, here's this political cartoon of the traction monster, which is this giant monopoly that controls, the subways and the streetcars and the utility companies. And that's how transit systems existed for a long time. A lot of them were branches of an electrical company or a gas company. And a lot of them were very closely tied with real estate. So in New York City, for example, they'd buy a bunch of land on the periphery of the city, they'd connect an elevated or subway line, that land would increase in value, they'd sell it at a massive profit, they'd use that money to build another subway line, buy more land. So in some cases, the transit may have been covering its operating costs, but it was real estate speculation that was really driving that. You see that in New York, you see that in Chicago, I'm sure there's plenty of other cities. Rochester, for example, the Seabreeze Amusement Park, that was a trolley park where they built, an attraction at the end of the line to make money, but also to encourage people to ride transit. So there's all of these other diverse interests that are coming together to fund transit and keep it operating. But, after World War II, there's a lot of headwinds. And there's a great book that's come out called The Great American Transit Disaster, which covers a lot of this and covers kind of what's happening in some cities in the years prior to World War II, but it's immediately after World War II, kind of the floor falls out. But essentially, World War II was a time there was extremely heavy ridership. There was not a lot of available funding for new equipment, and there weren't available materials for new equipment. So after the end of World War II, the transit systems have completely dilapidated vehicles, the infrastructure's in terrible shape, and most of them are still for profit. Some cities have brought them under municipal control. In New York City, for example, you have the independent subway system, which is city-owned, and then you have two other private operators, and they're competing. But in general, you have this for-profit operator that needs massive capital investment, and there's now car ownership, suburbanization, and there's racial segregation going on, and all three of those things are terrible for public transit. There's policy changes at the federal level that subsidize car ownership, subsidize highway construction, subsidize mortgages for houses in low-density areas, And all of these things become so much pressure on the private owners that they want out. They don't want to run transit anymore. It's not profitable. Now the government's the one kind of controlling where real estate's going when they're constructing highways. So the private owners want out. And this story plays out all across cities across the United States. There's different versions of it. But in many cases, the private owners strike deals with local governments for local governments to assume the responsibility of public transit. So, the Johnson administration in the 1960s, they have the Great Society program. And part of the Great Society was the Urban Mass Transit Act of 1964, which is aimed at stabilizing and rescuing the transit systems. So, there's now all of this federal money going in to stabilize your operations and buy new equipment. And the idea here is that you're taking federal money, so now you need to follow the federal rules. So, when you are receiving all sorts of federal funds, the federal government now has a little bit of control of some of the levers and can kind of guide policy in a specific way. So the state and local governments, they begin to buy out some of these large, struggling urban systems. And then at the same time, this Urban Mass Transit Act 1964, what it pays for mainly is a lot of new buses. There's all sorts of new equipment that gets on the road, but it's mainly buses. A lot of the properties have buses that are 20, 30 years old, and they replace a lot of their fleets. But there's some brand new rail systems that are built. So San Francisco, the BART system was built, the Washington Metro, Baltimore Subway, Atlanta Subway, the Miami Metro Rail. All of these were funded with the first round of cash infusion from the Urban Mass Transportation Act. Now, we can certainly talk about how successful some of these systems have been, some more so than others, because ultimately there was little local match required at the time. So there was a lot of incentive to build, not a lot of incentive to plan or view these rail expansions as part of a more holistic system. But the investment was there, the money came from the federal government to make this investment. So going from Urban Mass Transit Act to today, the Urban Mass Transit Act with the federal funds come all the strings attached. So the strings standardize a lot of how public transit operates, the rules transit has to go by, things public transit systems can do and can't do. And now it introduces the MPO system, the Metropolitan Planning Organization. So the federal money comes through the Metropolitan Planning Organization. There's that level of local control, even though it is federal money. So, there's a number of new rules that come into effect. But the general trend from the 1980s to present is funding, begins to go up, but fares become less important and operating costs rise every year, mainly driven by labor. Being in a developed country, very high labor costs. So the operating costs continue to go up, and transit systems become more and more dependent on state and federal aid. They're less dependent or less able to generate local funds to support their operations. And we get into a situation where we are today where there's usually a lot of capital money, but it's the sustained operating commitment that becomes the problem. And every transit system across the country will tell you it's really easy to find capital funding. It's really hard to find operating funding. And that's kind of where we are today. So, one of the things that I think is useful to try to understand transit is what I call the day one exercise. So pretend you're a new community, maybe 200,000 people, and the community has decided they want a transit system. So you have to set that up. You have to decide, first of all, you need a facility. You need somewhere to store your vehicles. What mode of transportation are you going to use for your community? What vehicle type are you going to use? What propulsion source are you going to use? You've got to set up the routes. You've got to have labor. You've got to administer the system. So that would be the bare basics that you need to run a transit system. So with a facility, the type of facility, the size of the facility, it's very dependent on the type of vehicles and your transit service. Obviously, a rail facility is going to look very different from a bus garage. You've got to fit trains in it, so it's going to be long and narrow, kind of like a snake house. While, bus facilities, there's multiple versions of it. But the facility is really important. At TCAT, we have an older facility. It's always been overcrowded since the day we consolidated. And it does limit how quickly we can repair vehicles, how many vehicles we can have, our ability to expand. So when you build a facility, you have to kind of future-proof it. You have to look not just at today's needs, but the needs 30 years down the road. And you have to look at the commitment to maintain that facility and sunset that facility as you want to build a new one. You need to have the space and equipment to store and maintain vehicles. You also want to make sure you pick a good location. Bus garages, they're noisy. They're not great neighbors, but you don't want to be really far away from the urban core because that's where most of your routes are. So if you're far away from the urban core, then you're going to have higher deadhead mileage. It's going to take you longer to respond to breakdowns and other problems. So, picking the location of your facility is really critical. And, I don't think that historically in the industry we've focused enough on facilities. We've oftentimes inherited an older facility. When I started, my first job was in Rochester. They had an old streetcar facility that over the years they had really put a tremendous amount of money into to make it more modern. But when you have an old streetcar facility and you're trying to work on buses, what you'll find is that the mechanics have to crouch because the pits don't go deep enough, because it's a much deeper pit you need for a bus as opposed to a streetcar. So a lot of these things have to be considered, and the facility is really important because it can really influence how your system grows. So mode choice is really important, obviously, and I think for the rest of this presentation, we're kind of going to assume we're going to talk really heavily about bus because that's the biggest mode of transit in the United States. But there's all sorts of wide arrays of vehicles. You have things like microtransit and small rural systems are a demand response, or even done with taxis in some cases. There's larger urban systems that depend heavily on rail. Between heavy rail and buses, you have light rail. You have all sorts of different modes, and they all have their pros and cons, and they all serve specific markets. But generally, the general rule is buses and road vehicles are very flexible. Rail systems definitely beat buses from a capacity and efficiency standpoint, but you're talking about major investment, environmental review levels. Rail is a massive undertaking. And then, of course, the density, the distance between stops, how fast and how far you want to carry people, how deep you want to permeate within a neighborhood, that all influences the type of mode that will best serve your community. So demand response is probably the most basic and cost-effective form of transit. Most parts of the United States, even very rural parts of the United States, have some form of demand response. Sometimes in a more suburban area, it's provided where the road network doesn't accommodate large buses. It's point to point. You provide it with a small bus or a small van. It kind of is a paradox, though, because as demand response gets busy, it becomes less reliable. So as more and more people use demand response, it becomes oversubscribed, the wait times go up, it becomes less reliable, it becomes more expensive, and then people don't want to use it anymore. So demand response is usually a good stepping stone to a fixed route bus. And generally, I would say when you start to get around 2.5 passengers per hour or over, demand response starts to struggle. And even your worst performing fixed bus route at 5 passengers an hour is still doing much better than the best demand response system can do. So, you oftentimes get these questions about why is a big bus running around empty? Well, a fixed route bus with 5 passengers per hour is still more efficient than a demand response and still more efficient than single occupancy vehicles. So fixed route buses, they're the most common mode of transit in the United States. They're really versatile. You'll find them in big cities. There's fixed route buses are still the backbone of Manhattan and New York City transit. They work in urban areas. They can do rural service. In theory, you really don't need much infrastructure. They can pull off to the side of the road and use any safe area to stop. If you don't want to put stops down, you can use a flag zone. TCAT has many multiple rural routes that operate in the flag principle where there's no marked stops. But ultimately, the success of fixed route bus is heavily dependent on the directness of your routes. Are the journey times on fixed route bus remotely competitive with single occupancy car? Do you have existing pedestrian infrastructure? Because this is often forgotten in transit, but every transit trip starts as either a pedestrian trip or a bicycle trip. Everyone has to walk or wheel themselves to the bus in some way. So, if you don't have that infrastructure to get people to where the bus is, the service will struggle. And is the land use transit friendly? If you're trying to negotiate a sea of parking lots with a 40-foot bus, that kills your journey time, it kills your reliability, it introduces tremendous amount of risk into your operations, and that will really harm your service. There's many cities, many suburbs where, the fixed route buses are constantly just fighting a sea of parking, and they're pulling out of one mall, one shopping center, going right back into another one, and that really harms the effectiveness of public transit. So, bus rapid transit, that's kind of come onto the scene, more recently. Great thing to know about bus rapid transit is there's not really a standard of what is and isn't BRT. There's some systems that may take a core bus route, stretch the stop spacing out so the buses are running faster, maybe have some transit signal priority, and they'll call that BRT. Or, like we have here, you can have the CT Fast Track in Hartford, Connecticut, which is basically running like a railroad. It's its own infrastructure. It's completely separated from pedestrian and vehicle traffic. In some cases, they actually do have crossing arms that come down and block the road when a bus comes. That was I think it cost over $1 billion. And some of the projects are done on a much, much, much smaller budget. So BRT is proving to be fairly versatile, but the idea behind it is using buses to mimic some of the characteristics of light rail that people really like, the frequency and the speed and level boarding and all of those things. But generally, I would say if you have some sort of a dedicated right-of-way, traffic signal priority technology, you have some enhanced shelter and passenger amenities, high-frequency service, that's when you're starting to be a BRT system, whether you call it that or not. But the advantage here is you don't have as much infrastructure cost as you do with a light rail, but you do have some of those advantages with that more frequent service that the public reacts well to. And then, of course, there's commuter coaches. So, here we've got, this is a picture of the exclusive bus lane going into New York City, which carries more passengers than many rail lines that go into New York City, very heavily utilized. The idea with commuter coaches is you typically run a bigger vehicle, 45-foot coach with a high floor. It's usually more comfortable, and it's to get people out of your central business district out into the suburbs. The disadvantage is they can get stuck on the highway just like a car can. They lack some of that congestion fighting ability that rail has, but commuter coaches are a great way to make a bus attractive for a more long distance journey. The big problem is they don't do well when you have lots of stops close together. Very slow to load and unload. They can't turn quite as well as a city bus. There's accessibility issues, and we'll talk a little bit about some of this later. And then there's a lot of informal road transit modes that exist in the United States. New York City, there is a network of dollar vans or jitneys. There's a lot of different cities that have informalized public transit. There's private employer shuttles that oftentimes where an employer will send a shuttle to a rail station for their employees. There's still some for-profit commuter coaches and for-profit bus routes out there. So I think it's important to understand that there is, in major cities, there is kind of a private public transit scene that still happens, and it's important not to overlook that. And this is very common in the rest of the world to have more private or informal share taxis or things like that. But these providers are part of the public transit ecosystem, even though they're much less visible. So talking a little bit about propulsion, for a long time with buses, it was just assumed that every bus on the road is a diesel bus. And now with new technologies, there's a lot more choices available. There's still a lot of fossil fuel vehicles out there, but there's new technologies like hybrids, electrics, and hydrogen. So we'll get into a little bit about each propulsion system. So the fossil fuel systems out there, the most common one is obviously diesel. TCAT's fleet is mainly diesel. We do have some electrics and some hybrids, but we're mainly a diesel fleet. Diesel is cheap, it's available, it's fast to refuel. It doesn't require a tremendous amount of infrastructure. On the newer engines, it has very low particulate emissions. In fact, in some cases, the exhaust coming out of a modern diesel bus is cleaner than the air that goes into it. Basically, what they do, the air comes in the engine, and then there's a combustion process. The gases are then recirculated through the engine again, and then you use a diesel exhaust fluid, which traps a lot of that particulate. The engine can go into a process called regen, where it takes a lot of that particulate out and kind of burns it off, and then ultimately you trap a lot of the particulate emissions. Now, particulate emissions are the black kind of sulfury smoke that you see on older diesels. It doesn't, modern diesels are not any cleaner from a carbon perspective. They still produce carbon, they still produce noise, they still produce other gases. So, even though diesels of today are much cleaner, if your air quality goal in your region isn't to reduce particulate emissions, they're not really helping. So in a city like Los Angeles, where there's a lot of smog, particulate emissions are, the big driver of that. But as far as, carbon or reducing some of the other negative externalities of diesel buses, the clean diesels don't address that at all. So there have been, in recent years, CNG and propane buses. I'm personally not a huge fan of them. They require very expensive and complicated fueling infrastructure. They still make carbon. They don't, it limits your range. It limits the longevity of the engine. The engines don't last as long. But, there's a number of cities around us, Buffalo and Syracuse, use those technologies. It does have some environmental benefit. So, hybrid buses, you start to see those come on the scene maybe now 20 years ago. The technology recently has actually kind of made another leap forward, mainly with the introduction of geofencing, where you can essentially geofence an area, and that hybrid bus will run electric through that area, so you can concentrate areas where you're trying to reduce noise and diesel emissions. But the idea behind a hybrid bus, it's kind of a bridge between a diesel and a battery electric bus. You have a smaller diesel engine that runs at a constant RPM that charges a battery, usually located on the roof of the bus. And then the battery takes over and feeds an electric motor during slow operation, stop-start operation. So instead of having the diesel ramp up and then waste all that energy when the diesel's idling, you kind of recapture some of the energy through braking, and you store the energy at low speed. So hybrid buses do offer some advantages, and they're a great bridge for transit systems that might not be ready for electrification. So, the old way of having electric buses was the trolley bus. So they're really common in Eastern Europe and parts of Western Europe as well. They existed quite a bit in parts of North America, but they're kind of now becoming more of an oddity. But the idea is very simple. Use overhead wires, in some cases wires that were used for trolleys, and you use that to power a bus. It's very clean. The buses last forever because they don't have a lot of moving parts. You have an electric motor. Maybe every 20 years you have to pull the motor out and replace some pieces of the motor. But for the most part, it's a great technology. It works well. The problem is, requires a lot of expensive infrastructure. The wires, the poles, the switches, which is where you have a change in route. I was talking to a planner for San Francisco Muni once, and they said when they install a switch for even any route change, each switch is $250,000. So you're talking about very expensive costs when you have to change a route. So it's a great place. It's a great idea where you have routes that are matured and you're not planning on doing a lot of changes. But in general, you are limited to where you can and can't operate. And then battery buses. So battery buses have probably been common now about 15 years. The technology still continues to advance very quickly. So the new battery electric buses we have at TCAT are are probably have twice the range that the old Proteras did, and that's just in the distance of a few years. So the battery technology is continuing to really advance. The charging technology is continuing to really advance. Great thing about battery buses, there's no tailpipe emissions. So however clean your electricity is how clean the bus is. But no noise, they perform better, they're much better at climbing, and then you have a much lower maintenance cost because with an electric motor, you're not having to constantly worry about lubrication and wear and tear. So they have a very long life cycle. What you really have to worry about on a battery electric bus is the batteries. The batteries do degrade over time, and in most cases, you're probably going to have to plan for a significant midlife expense, probably around $80,000 to replace all the batteries on about $1 million bus. So you just have to plan for that life cycle cost when you buy the bus. Battery safety continues to be an issue. Right now, Gillig has the only battery electric bus on the road that's safe. The New Flyers have recently been embargoed. Proterra's had problems. So there's still some safety issues being teased out with the battery technology. And in our area, we struggle with power availability. Is the local utility, are they prepared? Are they cooperative? And that's not the case everywhere. In some cases, like in the Pacific Northwest, the utilities are the ones pushing this. They want to sell more electricity. In the Northeast, where you have older infrastructure and the utility companies are less interested in building new infrastructure and they just want to collect the check, they're going to be a little more resistant to anything that would require new transformers or new power lines. And then we have hydrogen is out there. It's kind of a niche market, and it's been hard to find a manufacturer that's stuck with it. Hydrogen buses are very expensive. You're talking several $1 million per bus, while $1 million for an electric and $650,000 for a diesel. Hydrogen is great because for the most part, it behaves like a diesel bus. You don't really have range limitations. But unlike a diesel bus, the only emission is really water. They're not very noisy. They don't have any tailpipe emissions. But the technology to fuel them is very complicated, takes up a lot of space. It's very difficult for most smaller transit systems to implement. So if you're a larger transit system and you have an engineering staff, it can work. But as a smaller transit system, oftentimes you might struggle with this technology. But perhaps in 20 or 30 years, it might be a little bit more mainstream and easier for the smaller systems to adopt. And then, of course, I didn't want to dive too much into rail because we could do this entire presentation on rail. But you start to get into rail where you have buses that are overloaded, where you just simply can't run enough buses. And you do get a labor efficiency where transit labor is very expensive, and if you're trying to pair the most amount of passengers with one operator, rail wins because some trains can hold up to 2,000 people, while bus generally, an articulated bus, it's about 100 people. Sometimes you inherit rail systems. There's old commuter operations, I'm thinking like Boston perhaps, where there's this extensive network of old rail lines and the transit operator keeps operating them. Or rail does really well sometimes in areas where you have extreme traffic congestion and people are looking for an escape. With that dedicated infrastructure and that service that's not impacted by congestion. Some cases, the rail systems become a bit of a political boondoggle, so to speak, where they're built, but there's not the ongoing support to maintain them or the ridership isn't there. So sometimes it gets a bad reputation, but generally if you have the right conditions, it can be very successful. There's a number of different modes of rail, and again, I didn't want to get too much into rail in this presentation, but on one end of the spectrum, you have your very small automated systems, like what you see at an airport, JFK AirTrain. These are great where you need very frequent service, but you don't have the ridership to sustain the operating cost of a subway line. So that's where you do these automated systems. They work great for those things. Airports, I know University of West Virginia has a system like that. That's where they work great, where the ridership in the area demands that frequent service, but you don't have enough to sustain something more heavy duty like a subway. You have trams, streetcars, and trolleys. which operate a little different than light rail. They operate almost exclusively on the street. They don't necessarily have dedicated infrastructure. There's modern streetcars, there's heritage streetcars where, a transit system sometimes uses an older streetcar to make it look old. Then there are the true older streetcars that you see in parts of Boston and New Orleans. Then you get into light rail. Light rail is probably the most popular mode of rail transit right now in the United States, but light rail is typically, I guess it's called light rail, I think because the vehicles themselves are slightly lighter, but the infrastructure can accommodate steeper grades, sharper turns, and then heavy rail would be more like a subway or elevated train, and then you get into the really big stuff, which is your commuter and regional rail. So, think about Metra in Chicago, Metro North Railroad, some of the SEPTA systems, and certainly as you get into larger and larger trains, you're talking about more and more specialized knowledge that's required to run them, more money that's required to run these systems, more rules and regulations. So, as the size of the vehicle goes up with rail, the complexity increases dramatically. And then, not to forget, water-based transportation is a major part of public transit. So, New York City, for example, there's a Staten Island ferry, which is a massive mover of people in the region. At one time, the ferries in New York City carried more people than every other ferry system in the world combined. It's not true anymore, but ferries are still a very important part of the transit ecosystem in New York City, as well as San Francisco, Vancouver, British Columbia, Seattle. Where you have a water barrier, that's where they work well. They're never going to be competitive with land transportation if you have, a bridge or they're operating kind of along a coast, because they're just not going to be competitive from a speed perspective. But there's certain areas where the geography forces you to use ferries. All right, so now we're going to get into the cool stuff, which is the kind of how you plan and design your network. So a big piece of how you plan your transit network is dependent on your street geometry. And we'll get into a little bit about the different types of transit networks in a second. But where you have a grid systems work great, but not every city has a grid. On the right here, we have Cincinnati, which is, you've got a river valley here, and you have some pretty interesting geography that limits where bus routes can go. They can go great north-south. There's not many east-west passages in the Cincinnati area. And again, you have a lot of contours with the geography there. So the bus routes become kind of very wavy. They're not very straight. On this side here, this is the Twin Cities. So Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's a giant grid. Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, giant grids. That's where grid systems are going to do great. But ultimately, your street geometry and your topography influence how you can plan out your bus routes significantly. And a great way to look at this is look at any of the old cities in New England or even Europe. But Lowell, Massachusetts, got an old kind of radial street pattern. Streets aren't very straight. Basically forces all your bus routes to go in and out of a downtown area. So as I mentioned, grids are great. You basically just lay the bus route out. It follows the street. I think the best known grid transit network is probably the buses in Manhattan. They follow the streets. The bus route number is the number of the street. The big problem with grids is that you are basically having to follow the grid. So if your passengers are trying to move in a direction across the grid, they have to make lots of transfers. They have to transfer here, transfer there, transfer again. And if you have frequencies, transfers aren't a big problem if you have high frequency. But if you have low frequency, because you're never going to be able to coordinate transfers among 6 or 7 different routes, if you have low frequency, then the passengers get stuck, and then the journey times begin to really increase, and the system kind of doesn't work so well. So, if you're going to do a grid system, you need very high frequency to account for all of those transfers where the routes cross, because you don't necessarily have any area. I mean, in Manhattan, maybe around here, but you don't really have an area where the routes are naturally converging, so there's no good natural transfer point. So the other type of system, which is really common in smaller cities, but you do see them in larger cities, Rochester used one for a really long time, are pulse systems. So the idea with the pulse system is the routes start out here downtown, they go way out into the suburbs, the periphery, they turn around and they come back. And the pulse happens every 30 minutes, every hour, every 45 minutes, every 103 minutes. There's all sorts of different pulse systems. They generally work best for customers if they happen on regular intervals, on every, say, 0, or every 30, so that customers can plan for that. But they're great because everyone's guaranteed a transfer. So you don't have the transfer problem, but they create new problems. One problem is if you're doing the pulse every 30 minutes, your bus has 15 minutes to go out and 15 minutes to come back. And then, or you have to add a second bus. Say it takes 17 minutes. Well, that second bus then gets to the outside of the city and sits and is inefficient. So, they have that problem. The other problem they have is, what if you want to go from, here to here? Well, you've got to go all the way back downtown, make the transfer, and come all the way back out. So they become very inefficient, again, as far as keeping travel time competitive with cars. But you see these more in smaller cities. Another pitfall of them is you have to have a big central hub because all of your buses are converging at one point. And then when the buses go out, that hub is basically sitting unused. So you have all this infrastructure that you've built, and it's only being used maybe 10 minutes out of every hour if you have an hourly pulse. So, pulse systems very common, especially in smaller mid-sized cities. They have some great advantages, but they're not providing the best quality transit service for smaller cities. So there's a lot of different types of bus service, that we'll get into. You have express routes, you have your core and your high frequency routes, you have your neighborhood routes, circulators. We'll go through all of these. So express service, it's typically where you're operating larger commuter buses. You're trying to move people over long distances. You typically tie this with park and rides to try to incentivize people to use transit, get out of their cars. If you have a lot of congestion or very high parking prices, or a lot of issues with road traffic, these work really well. You base your schedule, it's based a lot around demand. It's not necessarily based around trying to have an even headway. So the buses run when people want them to run. And when they get full, if a bus gets full every 15 minutes, then you run it every 10 minutes. If a bus doesn't get full until you run it every half hour, then you reduce the service to every half hour. So you're really trying to manage more load factor than achieve a specific frequency with the Express. But it's usually focused on your weekday people commuting into the central business district, in some cases commuting out. But you typically have this problem where when the vehicles are going against the flow of people, they're empty. And sometimes in a big city like New York, the vehicle may only make one trip in that's full, and then it's taken so long to make that trip in, rush hour is over, so they go back out to a depot, they sit, and then they do it again in the afternoon. So you have a vehicle that's really only making 2 revenue trips a day. So very inefficient, but provides a lot of value to the community by reducing traffic congestion. You have your core high frequency, your trunk routes. These are your routes in a large city that would run every 15 minutes. You're trying to run along a major corridor. You're not necessarily going into all the neighborhoods, all of the shopping centers. You're mainly trying to move people into and through that neighborhood. You're talking about service 7 days a week, runs early in the morning to late at night. You can look at bus lanes and things to improve reliability, but your trunk routes are the ones that they go longer, and then they're trying really to move people across an area as opposed to in and out of it. So in order for the trunk routes to work, you have your last mile problem, obviously. So you have to look at your neighborhood routes and your circulators. So neighborhood routes, might be across town, or it might be a route that branches off from a trunk route. The point of a neighborhood route is to kind of do the heavy lifting, to go in and out of the shopping centers, in and out of the neighborhoods, down the windy streets. You don't want your trunk routes bogged down doing that, making lots of turns, sitting at traffic lights, because then everybody on the bus, whether they're going to that neighborhood or not, is having their journey delayed. So the idea, again, with the neighborhood route is trying to have that neighborhood bus do the heavy lifting and feed the trunk route. And then circulators, this is a great example of a circulator. Circulators sometimes exist as a bubble. Sometimes they're set up for people that don't know how to ride transit. They don't have a fare. They run very frequently. They have these nice colorful maps that other routes don't have. oftentimes they're used to connect, hotels, train stations, get people through a downtown area or an entertainment district really efficiently. And they may or may not be integrated with the rest of the transit system. So this is Hartford, their dash. There's not much on this map that would indicate that there's a whole other transit system here that's overlaid with this circulator. So in some cases, these are driven very heavily by the business community, and they're more of a, neighborhood tool as opposed to a transit tool from a more holistic system perspective. And then, of course, you have your trippers. Now, a number of transit systems advertise their routes as trippers. The public doesn't really know what that means. Trippers, basically, it means a route that operates maybe once or twice a day. You're trying to go to a hospital, a factory, somewhere where you have an event. That means a bus has to be there to pick people up and drop people off at very irregular times. So a tripper kind of ties into the rest of the system, but it exists kind of within a bubble to serve one specific purpose. A number of transit systems still provide school bus service. The regulations at the federal level try to discourage this, but some systems do. You typically see this with large urban cities where they cannot afford to have their own school buses. And then you have rural service. TCAT operates a significant amount of rural service. So the idea with rural service mainly is, you're trying to provide a social need. You're trying to connect residents in rural, isolated communities so that they can get into the city to get medical appointments, to buy groceries. Very resource intensive. Rural services are not supposed to be efficient. They're about providing that social need. You're talking about very high subsidies per passenger in many cases, $30, $40, $50 per ride. Limited frequency, maybe only a few trips a day. But, again, this is about trying to connect people with the services they need, and that's usually the goal of rural service. And then you have owls. Owls are buses that run in the overnight hours. So, many cities have these where their rail systems don't run all night, where then there'll be a bus network that takes over after 1 or 2 a.m. Some cases, for entertainment. We've recently introduced late night service at TCAT to 2:30 in the morning. It's been very, very popular. So it's great. And then in some cases where you have, say, a lot of healthcare or manufacturing, you may need to run service around the clock because that's when the shifts are changing. So owls are kind of a unique route that only run in the overnight periods. They're usually a more simplified version of the service that happens during the day. So how do you design a bus route? So, your street geometry determines where the bus can and can't go. But what you want to do in general, I guess best practice, is you want to have 2 anchors. So here we have Union Station in Chicago, downtown Chicago, the central business district. The other end is Loyola University. So the reason you want 2 anchors is it means that you have a decent load throughout the whole route. You also want to try to have things balanced. If you don't have an anchor on the end of a bus route, what happens is the bus runs school bus style, where it starts leaves downtown very full, and then as the bus continues on the route, it gets emptier and emptier, and then at the end, it's very empty. So anchors kind of help keep a steady load on the bus, which means it's running more efficiently. And again, what you really want to avoid, deviations, going into parking lots, lots of turns, things that slow the vehicle down, because that's slowing everybody on the vehicle down. And I guess a good rule of thumb is if you're deviating for, say, a hospital, if only 5% of the ridership is getting on or off at that hospital, yeah, you've made their trip, quicker, but 95% of the riders who are on the bus at that time are still going to have to incur a delay to their journey. So use deviations sparingly. So an anchor can be anywhere where you have a lot of ridership: hospital, railroad station, school, Walmarts. Walmarts are huge anchors, believe it or not. Downtown area, or it could be another transit center. But you typically want to aim for an anchor at the end of each bus route. Now, if you don't have an anchor, you can do a loop route, and this is the 10. The 10 isn't a terrible loop. I'm not a huge fan of loops. But you get the loop problem. So the loop problem is, what if you want to go from Milstein to Lake Street? Well, now you've got to ride the whole loop around. So the 10 does well because there's a hill. So people can ride it up the hill and walk down the hill if they want to go against the loop. But loops always have that problem. The other problem they have is where the loop ends. So, we end the loop at Commons, which is a great place to end the loop because everybody's getting off the bus. But say you don't have a point on the route where everybody gets on and off, and you end the loop at Milstein. Well, if you got on at Commons and you want to go to Sage, well, you've got to sit there now while the bus driver gets off, has a cell phone call with his wife, smokes a cigarette, does whatever. So you're sitting there waiting 12, 14, 15, 16 minutes. And in some systems where people aren't as nice as they are at TCAT, the driver might say, it's my break, get off the bus. So now you got to go stand outside, watch the driver smoke a cigarette. It's -20 out. Loops have that problem. And then there's I think I was told it was the Mrs. Myers rule. Well, Mrs. Myers is allowed to stay on the bus because she's elderly and she always rides the 8:10 trip. So you get into these weird kind of situations that are very frustrating for the customer when you have a loop. The way around it is you could do the counterclockwise loop, but that means you're having to double the amount of resources on that route. Or you can turn the route around, so AM it goes clockwise, PM it goes counterclockwise, but then that introduces confusion. But loops are great where you don't have an anchor or you have too many anchors, because then the bus is kind of just staying at a decent load factor as it travels the whole loop. So variants, branches, and patterns, they're all kind of the same thing, and I don't like them. I don't like either of them. So a variant, basically, here we have the Route 25 in Buffalo, New York. The main trunk here is in red. And then you have one variant that goes to the city of Tonawanda, another variant that goes to North Tonawanda. So the trunk may run, only during rush hour. The trunk might run all day, 7 days a week. This might run only during rush hours, and then this might be 3 trips only during rush hours. That's typically what you're trying to do with a variant. So you really start to see variants take off, in the 90s because transit systems begin struggling with operating costs, and they're trying to combine routes, and they're trying to stretch more and more out of the routes they have. But I'm not a big fan of variants, and I'll get to why. Now, you also hear the term a pattern. Pattern's a little different. So a pattern is any unique routing for a specific route. So, you might have like the 30. The 30 has one pattern that it does during the week, one pattern that it does on the weekend, which we've now named the 30W because it was confusing. But so there may be a case where at a specific time of day, a bus goes down one street that's different. You're trying to stay away from a school or something like that. A pattern is just simply how you codify all the different things that a route may do, without becoming a separate route or branch or variant. So here we have the branch of the MBTA, the green line. So this is all the green line. I imagine it's very confusing, even though they have other letters listed, but this is the branch, as you have kind of your trunk, and then typically what they do is one train goes out this way, one train goes out this way, this way, this way. So all of these communities from Mattapan all the way to Boston College are technically on the green line. This is a great example of branching and how it works. And then why I hate branching. I don't know if anyone's seen the Simpsons episode. In the 90s, the Simpsons was great at critiquing public policy. Lisa rides the bus, she gets on the 22, but it's the 22A. She gets sent out to Area 51A, not Area 51. Variants, very confusing for customers. Buffalo had a route years ago, the Genesee Street route. It had variants for A through P. Really hard for customers to understand. If you're having that many variants, I think you need to look at the route as a whole and what you're trying to do with the route, because it's probably not serving anything well. So let's get into trunking and staggering. So on the left here, we have what trunking is. Trunking is where you have a series of routes and you kind of force them through one corridor. And what that does is say if this route runs once an hour, this one runs once an hour, et cetera, and you space them all apart by 10 minutes, you can have service every 10 minutes on this corridor if the corridor needs it. Here's a great example. This is in Park City, Utah, where they trunk the routes through the downtown area where there's a lot of hotels, and through that they're able to achieve service every 7 to 10 minutes on buses that run every 20 and 30 minutes. So if you stagger the routes throughout a trunk, you can gain some really great service efficiencies. And a little bit about stopping patterns. And I do not cover stop spacing because you could do a whole presentation on stop spacing. But to answer the question about stop spacing, it's counterintuitive. You know, you can place stops a quarter of a mile in rural areas because you're not stopping at every one. In a dense urban area, you probably want to space them actually further out because you don't want to be stopping at each one. But this is an example from rail where you have a stopping pattern and you have different levels of service. So this does happen with buses where you have a local bus that will make all sorts of stops. You have an express bus that might just stop, you know, downtown and then only a few stops out into the suburban peripheries. And then you might have these skip stops, which kind of interface with the express, so you can transfer between the local and the express at specific intervals. Basically, stop spacing, the idea behind it is you're trying to put riders into buckets, and then that bucket gets put on a vehicle, and depending on where the bucket of riders wants to go, that vehicle makes stops that align with the patterns of demand. So through stop spacing, you can cater some service. It does exist in the bus world. You see it a lot in Manhattan, much more common in rail, and it's really common in Europe where they have all of this choreographed, so the local train will arrive at the exact same time as the express, and everyone can transfer seamlessly between them. And then at the end of the line, you know, you always need to turn the vehicle. So back in the day of horse cars or steam locomotives, you get to the end of the line, they'd take the horses off the horse car, they'd walk the horses to get some water, they'd put them on the front, and then they'd turn around. Or they'd take a locomotive, they'd change the locomotive or fill the locomotive back up with water, it goes to a Y or a turntable, they run it back to the front of the train. Buses are much easier because they really just need a loop, or they can just go around the block, but you still need that kind of end of the line. You need it for two reasons. You need it to recover any time if you're running late. So say you have 10-minute recovery, the bus is running 7 minutes late, it sits for 3 minutes, starts the next trip on time. You also need it for your operator comfort, you know, for them to go to the bathroom, smoke a cigarette, talk on the cell phone, maybe clean the vehicle, look for a flat tire. But you always need a spot at the end of the line that can accommodate where you can turn around the vehicle and where the vehicle can sit for a little while. So a lot of systems have a bus loop. Typically at TCAT, we look for areas where you can turn the vehicle around at the end of a block or in a parking lot. So now we'll get into scheduling. So scheduling is extremely complex, but what I'll say about scheduling is if you have the stomach for it and can handle the intensity of some of it, you will always have gainful employment in this industry because very few people want to do it. And a lot of the older generation of schedulers have kind of moved on, retired. So scheduling is a great way to get into the industry if you have that interest, have that kind of analytical mind. So we'll go over a little bit of the basics, but scheduling is kind of how you put everything together. So you have your run times and your time points. So a run time, and this is the Route 30 here. Well, you know, it's how long it takes you to run the entire route. But these are all times of day. So this is the mall to, I can't remember what JSPG is. It's the first time point at somewhere on campus. But, you know, essentially, well, let's look at Schwartz Performing Arts to Seneca Street. So 8 in the morning, it takes 5 minutes, but from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., it takes 11 minutes. That's because of traffic congestion. So you break up your run time into all these segments here, and then you collect data, you know, as the route operates on how long it takes you to get through the segments, and you add time accordingly. So these destinations, they're called time points, which is where the driver checks. They see if they're ahead of their schedule, behind their schedule. You can never leave a time point early. And you should try to space them every 5 to 10 minutes. And then at the end of the run, you should try to have about 10% recovery. So this is how you set the time it takes the bus to travel a whole route. Once you set the time, you begin to block the trips. So this is a really simple exercise of how blocking works. So bus 1 departs at 6, it gets the end of line at 6:30, sits for 10 minutes, does its next trip at 6:40, finishes that trip at 7:10, starts its next trip at 7:15. That becomes a cycle time. So you have a 70-minute cycle time that tells you how many buses you need. It's pretty basic math, but essentially you can see here we have 5 different colors, so it's 5 different buses to maintain a 15-minute headway on a route with a 70-minute cycle time. There's all sorts of tools people use to do this, but it basically tells you how many buses you need to maintain a specific headway. So you put all of this together into blocks, and blocks are for vehicles. So blocks are what the vehicle does. So block maybe a vehicle does 30s for 20 hours, and runs are what the operator does. So the run is what the operator's work is. They're assigned to do a portion of a block. They might work 4 hours, they might work 8 hours if there's a rest break, and then they take lunch. But with the run, you've got to think about the operator comfort. You know, you can't have an operator work 20 hours a day. You can't give them no breaks. You can't give them no lunch. Well, a vehicle doesn't really care. A vehicle will basically run until it runs out of fuel. So, you know, blocks then are runs are kind of like an overlay on blocks. So at the end of the process, you cut the runs into a process called run cutting, which is called that because years ago they had a long piece of tape, they cut it up into 8-hour shifts, so you'd have 24 hours of runs, you cut them into 8-hour shifts, and then you put them on a bulletin board and someone would pick those runs as their work. But once you have the runs cut, they're rostered. So rostering is taking runs that maybe 7.5, maybe 9 hours, whatever, and putting them into a 40-hour work week. How you roster and how you run cut has a huge impact on operator work-life balance. No one likes getting 2 non-consecutive days off where your day off is a Tuesday and a Thursday. No one likes late night work and then the next morning having to come in early or vice versa. It becomes very hard on your body to adjust. Generally, the things that really you get a lot of negative feedback from operators are splits, where you come in the morning, work a few hours, go home, come back in the evening. Unavoidable if you have rush hour service, non-consecutive days off, and if you mix the early and late work. Really, you'll get a lot of negative feedback and increases turnover. You want to avoid those things. And then sometimes you have to link blocks and runs a little bit. So, you have to get a vehicle to or from a route, to or from a garage. You have to do street reliefs where, the vehicle stays out, but you send a car to the garage to get someone back and forth to the bus. Sometimes you do depot relief where the driver drives the bus back to the depot. But basically, like I said earlier, you can't have an operator out on the road 20 hours. So you have to bring them back for breaks. You have to bring them back at the end of their shift. And you have to link the blocks together and link the runs together to be efficient. One way to do this is interlining. We do this with a number of routes at TCAP. I'm trying to think of a good example. But sometimes the route will come into Green Street and then turn into a different route and continue out. That's a good way to help improve efficiency. So we'll get into a little bit about fares next. Fares are really interesting, and I could have done the whole presentation on fares. So a little bit about free fares. I saw a number of heads perk up because I know free fare is always a big issue. Historically in the United States, fares covered all of your operating expenses or most of your operating expenses. And this is known as the fare box recovery ratio. If you're covering all of your operating expenses, you have a fare box recovery ratio of 100%. If your fares only cover 25%, you have a fare box recovery ratio of 25%. But since the federal government has begun to fund transit, apply more rules, the fare box recovery ratio has declined. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was probably 70, 80%. The 90s, it was probably 30, 40%. Now it's in the 20% or even lower. Some systems are in the single digits. Once you start to get 5% fare box recovery ratio, you have to ask yourself, is it even worth collecting fares at all? Because there is a cost to collecting fares. Now, recently, since the pandemic, a number of systems have waived fares entirely, but you always need a source to supplement that revenue. So at TCAT, say we were to get rid of fares for everyone, it's like a 20% budget cut. So, and then that also brings up the argument where if you can find the money to make fares free, could that money be better spent investing into the service to make the service run better? So you do get into those types of arguments. So fare collection is really complex, and it's a big pain point for transit systems. Right now, we're kind of at a crossroads where there's more technologically advanced solutions that are cashless coming on the scene, and you still have a lot of systems that are running their fare collection with cash as their primary concern. So some of the technologies, you have the old school vault fare box, the money goes in here, the operator looks at it, then they turn a handle and it dumps into this safe down here. They can't count how many riders you have, all they do is collect money. They can't issue transfers, very simple, they never break down, they don't require electricity, but you don't get any data from them. So in the 80s, you begin to get these mechanically registering fare boxes. Money goes in, you have a basic computer, very basic computer here that can track how many fares have been sold, whether they've been adults, seniors, disabled. The operator can program it, so if there's a rush hour fare, then the fare can go up during certain times of day. So, but they can really only handle cash. And a number of systems still use these today. And then you get into the more modern electric fare boxes. So this is what TCAT uses currently. It can handle money, coins, mag cards, and smart cards. So these are the most modern fare boxes. Ours are now processing contactless with your credit card. You can use your credit card on a TCAT bus, pay contactlessly. All of these fare boxes have the hardware to support a contactless transaction, but most transit systems have not turned that on yet. So, now the technology is, cash and all of the electronic fare media. And then you have cashless systems. So the cashless systems, and this is from Dayton, where they don't handle cash at all in the vehicle. You basically have a validator. The validator validates your phone, your credit card, your pass, and it says, yes, you can ride, no, you can't. It's great because it means that the driver's not having to wait while someone fishes change out of their wallet or fumbles with cash. You're not having to maintain all the hardware for cash, moves the vehicles along faster, reduces customer service complaints. This is a great technology. The main problem is not everyone uses cash. You still have a segment of the population that doesn't have access to smartphones, doesn't have access to credit cards, and for them, moving away from cash creates a lot of hardship. So there's, like I mentioned, cashless fares can be credit cards, mobile apps. You can have your reloadable fare media. In London, they're called Oyster cards. In New York, there were Metro cards for many years. Your student or employer ID. Europe, they have concessionary cards where typically you reach an age, or if you have a disability, you get a special ID that allows you unlimited free use of the transit system. Don't know if there's any in North America that do it, but that can be your fare media as well. So a little bit about smart and dumb cards. So the smart card reader is here, and that would be considered a smart card, and your mag stripe reader is here, and I would consider that a dumb card. So basically, it communicates with your smart card with RFID technology, and it can gain a lot of information from that, and it can communicate both ways with the card and the database. With the mag stripes, really doesn't communicate well. It can say, yes, this person can ride, or no, they can't. So I know this question will come up. Cornell IDs have an RFID capability, but they don't communicate well with the fare box. My understanding is that the mag stripe can only say yes or no, this person can ride, and the smart card reader, it's too, the amount of time that's passed between when the Cornell IDs were created and some of the new technologies there's just a legacy issue where it can't communicate through an RFID because there's so much difference in the systems. So what a dumb card can't tell a fare box. It can't tell, can this person ride at a specific time of day? Can't tell if they have a route-specific privilege, and it really can't gather much data aside from the ID number. So it can't tell a specific class of rider. So really good solution is you have a lot of great cashless technology out there. You have a lot, but a lot of it times it's being held back by an agency's dependence on the old cash box. So what you're seeing is kind of the mix and match approach, which is where you buy your fare media off the vehicle. You have just a dumb, or not a dumb fare box, but an old vault fare box that just collects the cash. And you're trying to push most of the riders to use those validators and new technologies, keep the bus moving along, but also you have the ability to do cash. So Dayton, Ohio, they don't take cash on the vehicles anymore. You buy your fares off the vehicle, either on your app, at a machine, or at a neighborhood partner. And in Europe, they've even taken it a step further where it's proof of payment. You don't even interact with the driver when you get on. There's no validation, or there may be validation of the vehicle, but it's not checked by the operator. You simply have a ticket or an app, and there's random fare enforcement. Really helps keep the vehicles moving on time. What you want to do from an operations perspective is reduce the amount of time passengers are spending standing at the fare box. So fare structures really influence how the system behaves, how riders behave to it. Best example is the flat fare, New York City. So you can travel on a flat rate from Far Rockaway to the Bronx, all for the cost of a flat fare. The disadvantages that you typically have a lot of ridership in the urban core, they're going very short distances, they're kind of subsidizing the longer trips. So that would be the criticism of it. So then you get into distance-based systems where you have zones. This is San Francisco here, where you have all sorts of different zones. This gets really complicated. You could probably do an entire presentation just on fare zones, whether they should be concentric or radial. The big thing you need to know about distance-based fare zones is while they're more reflective of the actual distance that a rider travels, if you live here, it costs you more money to cross this zone boundary than to go all the way to downtown San Francisco. So they do have an inequity to them if you're basing them on geographic characteristics. They're also extremely confusing for riders. So that's kind of the downside of zones. And like I said, there's a wealth of information on zones and which zones work better. And I know in Germany, some cities, for example, you could do probably an entire presentation on how some cities in Germany handle their zones. So generally, all transit systems have some way of incentivizing people that ride at high volume, usually through an unlimited monthly pass or subsidizing, day passes. The idea here is that if you ride the bus twice a day, 5 days a week, a monthly pass is, maybe 10% lower than if you just paid the cash fares. So again, the idea here is not to subsidize, but to incentivize people to use the system more and more often. And of course, you have transfers. Do you allow the transfer? Some systems give you like a 90-minute window. Some systems do a fee, like a 25-cent fee for a transfer, and some don't do any transfers, where each time you get off the bus, you just have to pay full fare again. And then a little bit about fare capping. This is something that TCAT is about to implement and has really kind of grown lately. Is basically, the idea here is that you cap the fare. So you take 3 rides, you bought a day pass. You take 11 rides, you buy a week-long pass. So I'm almost done. I'm kind of going to breeze through running the system. Basically every transit system, this is 2 Broadway, the MTA headquarters, a lot of administration at the MTA. Every system usually has these main departments. You have the executive, you have operations, HR. We'll go through really quick because I know we're a little over time. So the executive, that would be me, they're the one who makes the decisions at any transit system. All transit systems need to have a leader. FTA requires an accountable executive. The role of the executive is to set the strategy, the vision, guide the policy, make sure all of the departments are kind of working in that same direction. So then you have operations. Operations, they make sure everything goes out on the road. They oversee your supervisors, they investigate complaints, accidents, they respond to detours, emergencies. operations is 24 hours. If you work in transit operations, you just have to be ready to be called to work at any moment's notice. They also note chronic problems with service, and they refer that to usually planning to get fixed. Human resources, they do the hiring, they administer benefits, they'll deal with with union issues. Most transit labor in the United States is unionized, and you could do a whole presentation on labor relations in transit. IT, so IT does a lot. This is an example of some of the IT systems you might see. You have CAT-AVL, you have APCs, which count passengers, you have your fare systems. All of these systems kind of live together in an ecosystem. IT is the one who oversees that ecosystem. They also manage the public-facing website. You have marketing and communications. They push out information. And they also, bring back information. So they might manage outreach. They facilitate your public hearings. They usually help with your schedule production. And they usually oversee your advertising contract. Advertising is not a huge source of revenue, but it's not insignificant either. And then you have finance. They essentially manage the budget. They may oversee procurement. They help forecast how much service you should run so you're not bankrupting the system. So they help with your long-term and short-term financial planning. Maintenance, they keep your vehicles on the road, and they keep the facility from falling down. So, there's a lot that goes into transit maintenance. It's its own world. And again, I know we're a little over time, so I don't want to take too much time talking about maintenance. And then you have planning. So, we talked a bit at the beginning about planning. What planning does is, at a transit system, they usually design the routes. In many cases, they're responsible for scheduling, and they also set the service levels. And they may assist with a number of other areas. So that's it. I wanted to give opportunity for questions, and there is a talk back session as well, but, I didn't want to take up too much time, so.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We have time for questions in here. Maybe for people who are going to talk back, hold your questions till there. I'm going to go over here. I'll take the first question, and Sal can grab another.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Della. I'm a second-year Master's in Regional Planning student. Super interesting. Super quick question about how much of transit systems workforce are folks that are actively driving the bus or like front-facing. Like, how does that sort of labor distribution work out?
Well, it depends on the system. That's a really good question. And it depends who you consider front-facing. But essentially, the role of management is to support the people in those roles. But I would describe front-facing as the people operating the vehicles, maintaining the vehicles, doing things that are directly related to service. I would say 80% is probably good. So at TCAT, we have got about 120 employees right now, 70 operators, 15 mechanics, and then you have your janitors and people that maintain your facility. So I'd say we're probably pretty close to that. Some of your administrative functions you have to do no matter the size. So typically, as a system gets bigger, it scales becomes that number you might have more people in the front end services, but then two, sometimes bigger systems have much more complicated administrative structures and much more complicated departments. So but I would say 80% is usually a good rule.
Hi, thank you for your detailed lectures. And I'm Wei Chen, first year MRP student, and I have a question about how does your passenger data influence your route design and schedule decision?
We go through a lot of passenger data. That's how we make the decisions. So if we're going to change a route, the first thing I'll ask for when planning comes to me and says they want to eliminate a stop, change a route, add service, is I want to see the data. So, we do look at data at both a stop level. So when we eliminate stops, we eliminated some stops recently typically, if there's less than one rider per day, that's where we want to start thinking about that. So you look at your ridership per stop. You also look at load factors. Load factors are a huge way to know if you need to increase frequency or if you can get away with decreasing it should you need to, or decrease it to add service somewhere else. You collect the passenger data. Basically, there's automatic passenger counters on the buses. I didn't get too into this in the presentation, but when you get on or off a bus, there's a little box with lenses on it. That's actually a laser that you can't see. When you walk on the bus, it interrupts the laser. Depending on the profile of how it's interrupted, it either logs it as a person, and it has some logic, so it can understand a small person, large person, backpack, briefcase, small child. And we rely on that data very heavily when we make decisions, but you've got to also do a lot of outreach as well. But that's usually kind of like if you're trying to look at a route, it's kind of a good way to take the temperature and the blood pressure and the vital signs is by looking at that passenger data.
Okay, thank you.
I was on the TCAT board about 20 years ago, and the operating rule of thumb at that time was that passengers paid about a third. The three partners, Cornell, the county, and the city, paid about a third, and federal and state taxpayers paid about a third. What are those rough proportions today? I understand the fare piece has gone down.
So I would say now, if you count the Cornell fare agreement is our fare revenue, which you should, that would be passenger fare is about 20%. The partners all told probably pay roughly 15%, and then the rest is state and federal, but primarily state from a specific program called STOA that you probably know a lot about. STOA funding is right now probably like $8 million out of our $20 million budget. So it's a lot of state and federal support.
So the state and federal support is in the neighborhood of 65%?
Yes, roughly. I would say that's a good rough statement. Not including capital. And when you look at capital, that share is much larger state and federal.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Noel. Hi, I'm over here. I'm a visiting student in the department from Zurich, Switzerland, and I have a question related to data as well. So does TCAT do travel demand modeling for Africa or, the region it operates in, not only looking at the ridership data, but like general travel demand and travel behavior in Africa?
We do not. If there is any travel demand modeling that goes on in Ithaca, it would be done at the MPO level. So the MPO is like the regional planning, transportation planning arm. In most cities there who do all of the modeling. But, in a very large transit system like MTA in Chicago or Los Angeles, they may do some of their own modeling as well. If, say, we wanted to build, in Ithaca, a light rail or something very capital intensive that would require that level of modeling, we would probably hire a consultant with expertise. We don't really have the staff in-house to do that. But I know in Europe they do a much better job with modeling, and they're much more strategic, I think, about their transit planning than we are. But the general thing with TCAT is once you start looking more than a year out, that's typically where our planning ends, and then it becomes, usually the MPO would look at things a year and out further, at least for service levels.
Hi. Oh, over here. Okay. Anyway, my name's Mary. I'm a first-year MRP student, and I'm wondering if ridership or scheduling is affected by seasonality at all in TCAT or in other systems you're familiar with, and if so, how is that accounted for? Or how have you seen that accounted for?
So TCAT's highly seasonal. We do a fraction of ridership when Cornell is not in session as opposed to when Cornell is in session. Our busiest month at TCAT is usually September, sometimes October. Every transit system I've worked at, usually October is the peak or February. December and January have a lot of holidays and vacations, so you typically see a decline. People really like to ride the bus when it's cold. And when I worked in Minnesota, we learned that a lot, is that ridership actually would go way up when it was extremely cold. And bad weather, people like to ride more when it's bad weather because they don't like to walk or ride a bicycle. But yes, typically I would say fall and early spring, late winter is usually the peak for most transit systems. But everyone is seasonality. So if you're Park City, Utah, your peak ridership is obviously going to be during the ski season. So it all depends on the characteristics of your community.
Hi, my name is Suprita. I'm a first-year MRP student. So I had a question with regards to, how do you know how many buses you need to have for this particular route? Because you know the footfall on each bus, but it changes so much every day, every season. So how do you know how many buses to put on that route? And how do you prevent two buses going back to back and then a huge gap, and then how do you make that consistent? Because there's so many different routes and different buses and different amounts of students on each bus. So
That's a really good question, and I'm really glad you asked, because those were things I wanted to get more into in the presentation, but obviously, again, many topics covered could be their own presentation. So the way you determine how many buses are on a route, if you want to, there's two ways. You can do it by headway, where you're trying to establish a specific frequency, which is kind of what I explained with the blocking exercise, where you look at your cycle time and then you divide that out. So a 70-minute cycle time, and you want to run the bus every 15 minutes, you need 5 buses. But if you're trying to do it to balance out passenger load, which I think was your question, there is a mathematical way to do it where you look at your load factor and you want to achieve like a 75 or 85% load factor. There are mathematical ways you can do it, but typically the way we do it at TCAT, to be honest with you, is we just look at the volume of complaints we get, based on overcrowding. And if we see a large amount of complaints, we look at adding another bus. And it's usually more complicated than just, okay, there's more crowding, we need to add another bus. The problem usually is, do we have the bus, do we have the operator, and do we have the money to pay for the bus and the operator? So right now we're doing that exercise with the 30 in the evening or evening rush hour. We're looking at increasing it to every 10 minutes because we've been seeing a number of crowding complaints. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to add another bus on the route. So I think right now there's 6 buses on the 30 in the PM rush hour. We're looking at adding a 7th. And what that would do is you'd balance out the headway so that the bus runs every 10 minutes and the drivers would have a little bit more time at the end of the line to catch up on their recovery. So typically what you do is when you insert a bus, then you change the headway to try to keep it even. But yes, what we do it based mainly on customer and operator feedback. But as we get into a better position with the amount of resources we have available, it would probably get more scientific.
We have room for one more question. Just as a reminder, we will be hosting a talk back. So if we didn't get to your burning question about transportation, TCAT, or anything else you'd like to ask Matthew, feel free to come to the talk back.
No. Hi, Matthew. My name is also Matthew. Thank you for your awesome presentation. I'm a first-year master's student. And I briefly saw it mentioned up on the board in one of your graphics, but I was curious about the live tracking system and what is kind of the technology that goes into that and kind of the considerations with that. Because maybe not even with TCAT, but with a lot of other public transportation systems, it's faulty, it's inconsistent, and maybe these inconsistencies that people become upset with aren't, with the buses themselves, rather the systems that kind of monitor it. So I was just curious on what your perspective was.
I hope you're coming to the talk back because that is its own topic. The long story short, to condense it is, it's called a CAT AVL system. Every transit system hates theirs. All the transit riders tend to hate theirs. Not all, there's a few good ones out there, but historically that technology there's very few players in that field. The technology that they put out has to last a specific amount of years. There's a lot of federal guidelines that they have to follow. So it's actually discouraged a lot of entrance to the market. So what you have is you have a few very established companies with not a lot of incentives to modernize their product. And it's kind of locked transit systems in. So I can get more into this in the talk back, but CAD AVLs are a huge pain point for transit systems. They're not user-friendly. They don't always have the best information. I would say at TCAT, though, most of our problems actually have to do with the hardware in the vehicles. We have a lot of hardware failures on the vehicles, and then we can't do a lot with that hardware, so we have to then get a replacement part. Sometimes we had to wait 8 months for an antenna once, and when the bus didn't have the antenna, the bus was out there picking people up, but it wasn't showing on the tracker. And that really frustrates riders. So we'll get more into that in the talk back, but there's a lot of issues with the onboard technology, and it's getting better, but it's been a huge pain point. And if you use transit in other parts of the world, you'll realize just how much better it could be in this country.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you for Stella for organizing the talk. Let's give Matthew a round of applause.